am familiar with Gailhac, but I am no expert on mysticism and prophecy, let me tell you. So I will try to simplify this, as I have had to do for myself. In reading some of the talks and articles on mysticism and prophecy, which are terms, by the way, that we hear all the time now, in the past decades. We didn't hear much about a call to mysticism and prophecy as part of a call to religious life and to Christian life in general. So they're new terms. So I was reading some articles, and I came upon one that I really liked, and so I'll be referring to this one, especially during the day. It was a talk given at the plenary assembly of the USIG, that's the Meetings of General Superiors in Rome, in 2010. And the speaker was a Spanish discalced Carmelite, a professor of theology and a writer by the name of Ciro Garcia, OCD. And he entitled his presentation, Mysticism and Prophecy, a Style of Life and New Areopagus. And near the beginning of his talk, he made three very powerful statements that I like very much. He said, all our founders and foundresses were mystics and prophets. And then he said, and we are called to recreate their mystical prophetic charism in the church. And the third thing he said, without mystics and prophets, consecrated life does not have a future. He reminds us that mysticism and prophecy are the essential and closely connected dimensions of every Christian identity, including the new members of the extended family. So I'm very much aware of you as I'm going through this talk, because you're in here too. Mysticism may be more directed toward union with God, and prophecy may be more about the search for God's will in the here and now. But the combination of both is essential to our call as Christians and religious. And then he goes on to say, there is no authentic mysticism if it doesn't flow out of an ethical and prophetic commitment. Nor is it possible to think of prophecy which is not nourished by deep union with the divine. And I agree with him strongly about that notion that the two are bound together. But just for the sake of clarity, and to better honor the schedule for today, I'm going to separate these two inseparable aspects and look first at Gailhac's experience and legacy as a mystic. And this afternoon we'll look at the second dimension of prophecy. And so this is really a no-no that I'm doing. I'm separating this. But I want to spend time with each. It's very challenging to talk about mystics, as you can imagine. I sometimes think they make us uncomfortable. And it's hard to identify with them. It's so easy to imagine that they are very rare. I think when I was younger, I was fascinated by the story of St. Gerard Majella, the young Redemptorist lay brother, who was assigned to the kitchen to help the chief cook. And every time the community was assembling, it was time to bring the food out and so on, he'd be levitating. Come down here. They're waiting. So you get the idea that mystics levitate, they have bilocation, and very rare. Or, on the other hand, a little more subtle, Teresa of Avila, beautiful statue of Teresa of Avila, in a state of ecstasy being pierced by the angels. On the other hand, the temptation is to speak very vaguely about mysticism, sort of run by it, call it contemplation and get past it before anyone notices. And that dilutes its real significance. So I found Father Garcia's talk very helpful in trying to break down what is meant by mysticism, to help us to relate to it. He reminds us, first of all, that we are speaking about mystical experience, a direct experience of God, which goes beyond intellectual knowing. It's not grasped through reading or thinking, but rather through living and experiencing. The mystical experience is often marked by love, feeling of love and joy, but it's not the same as an emotional experience either. It seems to have as its main objective the search for a union that breaks through the confines of ego. So it usually involves that idea of losing self, dying to self, in order to put something else in the center of our lives. It immerses us in an experience of God's love. And Garcia says, it is experienced, not read about. God is love, he reminds us. And the only proper and mature response is to just allow ourselves to be loved and to be healed. The mystical experience is essentially a divine passion to experience the presence of God, to suffer, to feel, to accept his transforming action. And thus it's a bond, it's a relationship, it's a loving glance, it's a loving contact with a reality that is the secret, most intimate center of one's existence. And another author puts it very succinctly. He says, Christian mysticism is about transforming you. Christ is the focus of Christian mysticism. The passion is to become fully permeated by God as Christ is, to become by God's grace like Christ, fully human and fully divine. Now, the more I try to understand the nature of mystical experience, the more I realize it is not rare at all. This is what we're all called to. This is God's desire for us. So at this point, let me give you two other examples of different expressions of mystical experiences so that you begin to see there are so many different ways of experiencing this. One Easter morning, Veronica Brand and I went to Mass in the General Lake Parish in Rome. And the Gospel, of course, was the account of the appearance of Jesus in the garden to Mary Magdalene. And after the reading had ended, the people sat down and the pastor walked over toward the altar because he liked to preach his homily from that place. And just then, an old woman, well in her 80s, very petite, was sitting in the row just in front of Veronica. And all of a sudden she stood up and she raised her arms up and she shouted, "Oh, how beautiful he is! Doesn't anyone else see him?" And then she got out of the bench and she prostrated herself right in the aisle, flat down. I was waiting to see what the priest's reaction would be. I thought maybe he'd say, would somebody... But instead, he immediately said, yes, Olga. Called her by name. Yes, Olga. There are many mystics in this parish. And then he proceeded to give his 20-minute homily, and she was still prostrate right in the aisle. And when he had finished, he gestured to a parishioner to help her up. She got up, she came right back into the bench, sat down for the rest of the Mass. And she was fine. So I asked him, what do you think? It clearly was a felt experience of love, an experience of the risen Christ that caused her to just shout out her love to the entire congregation, and to then prostrate herself in adoration for the next 20 minutes without moving. So he recognized her as a mystic in his parish. And he saved her reputation in the most wonderful way by acknowledging that fact and calling her by name. Yes, she's a parishioner, and she's a mystic like many of you, these Jews. Now, on the other hand, we could see someone like Saul on the road to Damascus. Surely one of the conversion of Saul, one of the most important events in the early church. Described 3 times in the Acts of the Apostles. And Luke talks about light and a voice and physical impairment, all signs of epiphany, a divine epiphany. But what always strikes me is that when Paul himself describes his conversion to the Galatians, there are no lights, no camera, no action, just a simple statement. Paul says, he describes his mystical experience, because surely it was a mystical experience by the definitions I suggested. He describes it in the simplest way. He says, he who set me apart before I was born and had called me through his grace was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles. No light, no voices, no strange action and so on, as we read 3 times in Acts. Just the Father chose to reveal his Son to me, so that I might teach him, might introduce him to the Gentiles, preach him to the Gentiles. So Paul will later insist that what he preached he did not receive from other people. He didn't read it in the Gospels because the Gospels didn't exist. It was the fruit of that mystical experience on the road that just continued to unfold as he lived and preached and created one community after the other. It was preached to the early Christian communities, and his message was then carried on by Timothy and Titus and Aquila and Priscilla and Lydia and Silas and Chloe and Thecla and all the others, the leaders in those small Christian communities. And it has reverberated down to Gailhac, to us, and to others, all the way through that mystical experience that just reverberates through the church to the present. I had a spiritual director once who said, you know, these experiences are like time-released capsules. You know, you get something like a leave or something. They tell you that the first 3 hours there'll be this much released, and then 3 hours later it'll still keep releasing. And that's the way she described a mystical experience, a direct experience of God. That it just reverberates through our lives. So even if it's not a question of you live in a state of mysticism, so you tend to levitate when you're not supposed to, one mystical experience, 2, 3, that just keep reverberating through your life is what we're talking about here. So for Paul, the experience was the Father revealed his Son, Jesus Christ, crucified on Calvary, has risen from the dead, is alive, lives in us, and we live in him, and through him we share in the divine life. And that has just